Okay, I'm supposed to be taking a vacation, but I was studying in Isaiah 53 last night, and this thing is so earth-shattering, I gotta put it out now. It's a real pistol to do this, but it's so important. Okay, on the left-hand side, what you're seeing is part of the video I did on Hypothesis 4, and the link will be in the sidebar of the description, so that you can see that movie again. It's really important. This is a major rhetorical style of the Old Testament. It is not Bible codes. When they do verses that have prophetical content, it's not going to just be only Isaiah. When they do verses that have prophetical content, they actually meter the verses to tell you the number of years from the time that they're writing to the time that the thing that they're prophesying is going to occur. It's not Bible codes. It's a deliberate meter. That means that when they gave the prophecy, everybody knew that meter. It was on purpose. And the idea was that when you remembered the verse, because of the meter, you would remember the number of years and you could use it like a calendar. It's very prosaic. And this has been lost to Judaism. It's been lost to Christianity. We need to do some study on this. Somebody should do his doctoral dissertation on this. Okay, maybe somebody at Hebrew University or something. This is really important. So I'm going to walk you through this in Isaiah. There's going to be other examples in Ezekiel and Jeremiah, etc. But I don't have time to make that stuff. Somebody just go look for this, okay? Now let me show you how it works in Isaiah so you know how to spot it elsewhere. All right. In the left-hand side of the screen, you've got Isaiah 52:13 through 15 in Hebrew. I've parsed it according to the syllables. You have to know their syllabification, you know, where they elide a vowel or something, or where they, you know, they draw it out in order to get the meter. And as you can see, in Isaiah 52:13 through 14, it's 42 syllables. Through 15, it's 77 syllables. Matthew plays on the 42 syllables, as I said in earlier videos, plays on the 42 syllables when he crafts his 14s in the Matthew 1 genealogy. Luke plays on the 77 syllables by counting to the 77th son in his Luke, I think it's Luke 3 genealogy. I covered that in prior videos. I got to move on real quickly here. Okay. When Isaiah writes Isaiah 53:1, which you see there in the left-hand panel, all right, he is writing it 126 years before the temple is going to fall. And in the right-hand side of the screen, you see the temple's dedication date of 950 BC, and it falls in 586 BC. This is really important. So Isaiah is writing Micheini Nishmotenu, which is Isaiah 53:1 in Hebrew. He's writing that 126 years before the temple's going to fall, which means he's writing it in 712 BC. And you know that because the number of syllables beginning at Isaiah 53:1, which I showed in earlier videos, ends with 126 syllables at Isaiah 53:4. All right, you see where the 203 is there on the left-hand panel in red? Just before the 5, the blue 5 is for verse 5. So at the end of Isaiah 53:4, he has completed 126 syllables. Why? Because he's talking about his report. Micheinin lishmotenu. Okay, you know that verse. All right? So it's 126 syllables by the end of verse 4. Now it's also, at that point, 126 years before the temple falls. The temple falls in 586 BC. Right-hand side now highlighted with the cursor. All right? That date is 126 years prior to the date it should have lasted, which is in row 145 of the worksheet that I'm showing now, in the right-hand side. All right? So he's paralleling the date he gives his report in Isaiah 53:1 through verse 4 with the 126 years the temple will have left to run, but it gets raised beginning in Isaiah 53:5, which is Wahu mecholal mepshenu. Okay? Meduka mawonotenu. You know, I mean, you can read it on the screen on the left. Musar shlumoeno alaya. I can never say that word right. Ubahavorato nirpelanu. All right, that's verse 5 in Hebrew. All right, that verse begins another 126 syllables that ends at the end of, let me pull it up here, at the end of verse 8. You see where the 329 is in the lower right-hand corner, lower left-hand corner of the screen? That's 126 syllables from Isaiah 53:5 to end of Isaiah 53:8. So he's paralleling, he's making the same number of syllables because he's telling you, okay, hi, I'm talking to you now. The temple's got 126 years it's going to last from the time I start talking to you. And at the time it finishes, it's going to have 126 years left on its promised 490 years. So he's telling you it's going to stop 126 years short. He's telling you the exact same information that God's going to use in Daniel 9. So God is talking back. When God talks to Daniel in Daniel 9, he's using the Isaiah prophecy to show how he's going to craft a new 490. Because Isaiah's going to tell you the same thing. All right? Because now we get to... I covered this in the Hypothesis 4 video. Okay, now we're going to get to the last part of Isaiah 53. And from Isaiah 53:8, where it ends here, is 329 syllables. Because remember, Isaiah's debiting by the end of Isaiah 53 where the Samex marker is, just before Isaiah 54:1. That's 462 syllables. He's debiting 28 to allow 21 years for the rebuilding of the temple, and 7 years to allow for the hedge to reject Messiah. He's using the same timeline as God is going to use. In fact, God's quoting Isaiah's meter in Daniel 9. He's quoting it. All right? Because it takes 21 years to build the temple, and Isaiah knows that in advance. And there's the 7-year hedge on rejecting Messiah that's built in, because remember, David died in 963 BC. So it was known then that the outer limit of time was 1,000 years from that deadline. So Isaiah is here taking his meter and balancing to the deadline. He's saying, hi, in Isaiah 53:1, I'm writing you 126 years before the temple's going to fall. That takes you through the meter of Isaiah 53:4. And then from Isaiah 53:5 through 8, there's another 126 syllables, which is telling you, hi, the temple stops 126 years short of its 490 promise because of Israel's apostasy. All right? So it should have gone to 460 BC, but it stops in 586 BC. All right, and then after that, this is the killer. After that, he's actually giving you the chronology of when the temple will be rebuilt. Because in verse 10, you have 28 syllables. Verse 9, let me scroll it up. In verse 9, from between verse 9 and verse 10, you have 28 syllables. From verse 10 to verse 11, you have 35 syllables. That's a sum of 63. Okay, from 586 BC until the rebuilding in 516 is 63 years. Well, it's 70 years in 516, but the actual rebuilding starts here in 537. All right, but then there's a hiatus, and the uninterrupted temple construction starts in 521. And ends in 516. That's 7 years. It begins early here, and it ends in Adar, as you can see on the screen. Adar is the end of the Jewish year. So it's 7 years. All right, 7 years from 70 is 63. So that's Isaiah 53:9 plus Isaiah 53:10 is 63 years. All right, and then... this is such a killer. The rebuilding of Jerusalem, its deadline is 70 years later. That's illustrated in Isaiah by Isaiah 53:11, which is 28 syllables, and Isaiah 53:12, which is 42 syllables. 42 and 28 equals 70. And that's depicting the time that's going to be allotted for the rebuilding of Jerusalem. And he's also making a play on the fact that it's taking place during the believer voting window, which is the 70 years between 466 and 396 BC. Because God's constructing time in 490 plus 70 for voting, plus another 490 then begins if the voting is positive. Well, the voting is going to end up being positive. Isaiah's forecasting that when he makes the syllables. Now, that means it's a rhetorical style in the Old Testament. Because you don't do a rhetorical style like this to be hidden. There's nothing hidden in the Bible. The Bible codes people are nuts. Okay? God does a rhetorical style to be obvious so that you will remember it. He's constantly trying to remind you by every rhetorical style possible. In this case, the meter is telling you the number of years so that you can count it like a calendar. I mean, all of the priestly courses were prophetical. They were telling you in this month, this thing is going to happen in the future. That's why David designed them the way he did. All right? And I go through that in my passplot.htm web page, showing you the priestly courses because it's real important to know them because they're countdown to Messiah. He's telling you Messiah's schedule. You're supposed to treat it like a calendar. Okay, I'm 10 years away now. I'm 5 years away now. What do I do now? That was supposed to, light a fire under you to grow up spiritually. Okay, well, Isaiah's doing the same thing here. All right, and I don't know how it could be more obvious. The trouble is I have trouble proving this to you on the screen. So let's quickly do a summary on it. Okay, Isaiah 53, between Isaiah 52, 13 and 15 is God's decree. This is the real decree of God. There's no infralapsary and supralapsary, and that's all a bunch of garbage that theologians made up. God's decree is in Isaiah 52, 13 through 15. He decrees Christ, and everything comes from that. All right? So Isaiah 53:1 now he's talking in the present. His report he's giving now. And he's giving it 126 years in advance. The meter tells you that through verse 4. Beginning at verse 5, he's telling you, this is a parallel to the fact that the temple is going to stop 126 years short of its scheduled, promised 490 years. And that, for us, is 586 BC. And that takes you through verse 8, all right, the end of verse 8. From verse 5 to verse 8 is another 126 syllables. Then he tells you the temple reconstruction timeline, which starts in verse 9 with the syllables of 28, plus verse 10, which is 35. Let me get that to show better. Verses 9 and 10 total up to 63 years. Okay, 63 years is debiting for, the 70 allotment was to 516 from 586. Okay, but they start temple reconstruction, which means the blessing starts again in 521. 521 to 516, because this is early in the year, this is at the end of the year, is 7 years. So Isaiah is debiting the 7 years from the 70 years when he does 9 through 10. So you know when temple construction will start. All right? You know that it's going to start in earnest in 521. You have a schedule. It's just like, it's January and here's when December occurs. It's very prosaic. And the Jews lost this, and so did the Christians, of course, so we're all to blame. Forget the blame thing. Just let's learn this now. Okay, so Isaiah 53:10 and Isaiah 53:9 total 63 years to depict temple reconstruction. It's being debited, because 70 years ends at 516. Okay, and then Isaiah 53:11 and 12 tells you the rebuilding time for Jerusalem, which goes from 516 to 446, which of course Purim almost stopped. But David's time grant protected it, as you can see there. All right, so because the temple was rebuilt, it could go beyond David's time grant to 446 because the temple was up and running in 516. That bought the 70 years to get you into the 70-year voting period that completes in 446. So Israel voted positive, and Jerusalem therefore got rebuilt in the voting period, and the world could therefore continue to live. So here we're going to see the example through the meter of the timeline in Isaiah. And Jeremiah clues into that when he uses the 70 years. And obviously at God's behest. And the same thing for Daniel 9, which is why Daniel doesn't ask God what the heck he's talking about. In English, the 490 seems to come out of the blue, but it's all over the Old Testament. You just have to know how to spot it. And you spot it by the numbers. And one of the aspects of numbering in the Bible is meter. And so here we're going to see it in Isaiah's meter. Now in front of you is the first 77 syllables, which comprises all of mankind. That's why Luke 3's genealogy goes back to Adam. It's a decree in Isaiah 52:13 through 15, which in Hebrew is the beginning of Isaiah 53. There's a Samex marker right after Isaiah 52:12, which tells you when Isaiah 53 begins. It begins in what we call 52:13. So Luke 3's genealogy goes back to Adam, playing on the 77th son, which he's picking from Isaiah. Now, by contrast, of course, the Matthew's focus is different. He's tracing the kingly line. So in Matthew's focus, he's tracing the number of legitimate generations from Abraham to Christ. Now, you have to say legitimate because Athaliah was queen during part of Israel's time, and so Matthew is leaving out her progeny in 4-generation curse. And so he skips from Ahaziah to Jotham in his genealogy, which leaves 42 generations, because Jotham was the son of Ahaziah, the descendant. And so that's why Athaliah's kids are getting skipped over. So that's why you have here Matthew 1's genealogy of 42 generations. It's a hypostasis, God-man, it's a clever play on words. And Matthew picks up on this in Matthew 1's genealogy. So he's picking up from Isaiah also. And that's where you get that. Next in line are 2 35s. The 35 in Isaiah 52:15 and the 35 in Isaiah 53:10 are both on the topic of atonement. Now, in the Hebrew, there's a play on words between being shocked and being atoned. They have the same sound, basically. And so Isaiah is playing on that, and he's making a parallel. Again, it's a God-man parallel, because hypostasis is what this is about. So you have 35 syllables there in both places, because Isaiah 53:10 is on the actual contract to make sons by atoning for them. Now, it also happens that in 606 BC, which is 3,500 years exactly from the year of Adam's fall, and that year Nebuchadnezzar makes his first attack on Israel and takes away hostages. So the subjugation of Israel begins in 606 BC, the 3,500th year from Adam. And you'll see all this in the worksheet. So that's what the 35s represent. Okay, there's another calendar inside this calendar of Isaiah 53's meter. I'm so shocked about it, I don't even know what to say. So I'm just going to outline it. It's not going to be fancy like the other video. On the left, again, you see Isaiah 53. And on the right, again, you see the timeline, this time focusing on the time from David is crowned until the first temple is destroyed. It's a little bit smaller, so you better be watching this full screen in the original movie download. Okay, I'm going to show you, I'm just going to show it to you because I don't know what else to say. This is Isaiah 53, and I'm only showing a certain part of it right now. This covers Isaiah 53:1 and 2 all the way down. That's 56 syllables. And that 56 syllables is mirrored. Oh, I wish it wouldn't have disappeared. You saw it. It's 53:1 and 2. That 56 syllables is mirrored from 712 BC when Isaiah starts to give it during the reign of Hezekiah right here. Okay, on the right-hand side, wrote 122 of the worksheet. down to what is probably the time that Manasseh was taken by the king of Assyria. Because 56 years would take you to 656 BC. Ashurbanipal was doing his campaigns during that time, and I couldn't find actual proof of it on the internet, but maybe I just didn't look far enough. But Manasseh was taken away by Ashurbanipal. He was restored to power because he prayed to God, despite the fact that he was, he was probably the worst king of Judah. And he was restored to power, and then it looks like he had another 15 years until he died, which is kind of interesting because Hezekiah also had the same sort of life story. He went south in his spiritual life about 15 years, and he was going to die, and then he prayed, and God restored him for 15 years. Hezekiah was a good king, however. Manasseh really wasn't. But in both cases, if they prayed to God, they got restored. Now that 56 years is reflected here in Isaiah. If we start the count here at, the mouse doesn't work well when I'm recording. If we start the count at 53:1 at 712 BC, 56 years later is 656 BC. So what this ends up being is an actual total calendar in chronological order, more than I thought it was in prior videos. Okay, now let's go about proving that. Alright, the next step would be here, what we had established was that there was 70 years going from verse 3 through verse 4 to the end of verse 4. Again, I'm sorry about the mouse not working. I can't do anything about that. All the way to the end of verse 4. And I'm sorry that it's in black, but that's the way the program works in Photo Premium 9. That takes you 70 years from verse 3 to the end of verse 4. That 70 years ends up being reflected here. It was going from 656 all the way to the very bottom right-hand corner of the screen. See if I can scroll it up a little. The temple's destruction. From 656 to 586 is 70 years. So again, here in Isaiah, this last row here of the last part of verse 4 is playing on 586 BC. Now, if you look at the text, because I parsed it according to the verse, the versification he's using, it's Lohim Umneh. Well, what else would the temple be but that? Afflicted by God. Alright? I mean, the way you have to do this when you're tracking the verses and the meter, you got to tie to the content of the verse, because he's going to parallel the meter as a calendar to the actual content of the verse. It's not random. It's not that stupid Bible codes thing. Alright? The content of the verse is going to be reflected in the meter, and as we can see here, alright, in verse 1 and 2, alright, which is 56 syllables, it ends with us not esteeming. Wait a minute. It ends with us not esteeming him. Now 53:1 and 2 is about him growing, him loving, him being good, and us not caring about him. Okay, well, the precursor, this is a paradigm. The precursor to that was the temple represented Messiah, and we didn't care enough about the temple. We, meaning the Jews, I mean, didn't care enough about the temple to keep it going. And in Manasseh in particular was actually putting pagan gods inside the temple, as you can read in the 2 Kings account of him. Alright, so then the next 70 years, which, because of that, the 70 years have to play. Alright, 70 years, that's the first part of the 70 years. And then here's the ending of... the mouse is driving me nuts. Here's the ending of the 70 years. I can't get... there we go. Well, I had it. You saw it. All the way to the end of verse 4, which takes you to Lohim Muneh, temple destruction. Alright? So now, this row right here that's outlined sort of in dark gray is 586 BC, which corresponds to this dark gray, when civilization was threatened because the temple was down. The temple kept the world going. You know, that's the doctrine the Bible is telling us. That, you know, I can understand why, you know, the Jews didn't pass it on to their kids, because it's a pretty scary doctrine. It could get them in trouble if they're living in a foreign country. Now, but the Bible isn't so shy politically, and the numbers work. You can test them. All right, so at that point it's 586. Now the chronology continues right in order. So we got verses 5 and 6 are also 56 syllables. And they're starting at 586 BC, which we just saw. 586 BC minus 56 takes you to 530 BC. In 530 BC, I don't show it on the calendar here, but you can check it out on the internet. Cyrus dies that year. Now remember, Isaiah is the first guy to talk about Cyrus. Alright? Cyrus dies that year. He's also, just like Israel will be in diaspora here, alright, she's going to be in diaspora at this point, 56 years after the temple's destroyed. She's in diaspora. Okay, well, 56 years afterwards is 530 BC. Cyrus, of course, has got control of Israel at that time. Cyrus himself dies while on campaign. He's outside of his own country too. I'm just relating this. You know, there are just too many things that you can't call this coincidence. All right, verses 7 and 8, as was said in all the other videos, and being repeated here, is that 70 syllables more, verses 7 and 8. Okay, the content tied to the 56 years was Mechul Mecholal Mepshenu, alright, coming all the way down with Uyehua Hifkibot Awon Kulanu. Alright, yeah, the temple is struck for our sins. Alright, the guy Cyrus, who was the guy who wanted the rebuilding of the temple, was struck. So now the temple still isn't being rebuilt. Okay, 7 and 8, this is the 70 years, another 70 years ensues. But now we're getting into the period when the temple gets rebuilt. Verses 7 and 8 take you from 530 BC all the way down to, and you've got to look on the right hand side of the screen again now, from 530 BC, which again I don't show Cyrus's death on here. I show Cyrus decreeing it, but God had decreed it prior. But he dies, you know, 530 while the temple was still under construction, during the hiatus there. All right, but from 530, pretend that was 530 in the right hand corner, down to 460 is when the temple would have gotten its new 490. That is covered. So you're looking at, by the time you get to the end of verse 8 here, which is going very slowly because the cursor doesn't work well. By the time you get to the end of verse 8 here, okay, the text is saying, Mipeshami neglamo, alright, the temple's time is up, even if it had never been raised. That's 460 BC at that point. Alright, and here it is on the calendar so you can see it. That's the end of the first temple's 490 had it never been destroyed. But of course it is destroyed. And then by this time, 460 BC, it's also been rebuilt, because it was rebuilt in 516. But it's 460 BC when it would have had to get a new 490. Keep that in mind. Okay, so now we're going to move into verses 9 through 12. I need to kill myself, I think. The chronology continues in order. It's not that the other things I've said about this meter are not untrue. It's that they're layered. They're layered on top of each other. So, verse 9, 28 years. I really do have to kill myself. Verse 9 is 28 years. Okay? And what's 28 years from 460? So what was the 28 years? If that verse 9 represents? Watch. 432. It's really hard to see that. Let me push it over a little more. See, if you look in row 148 of the worksheet, Malachi was written in 430. I'm saying 433 because I got that from outside sources. So 432 would be the year, if you count it from 460, when using Isaiah's meter, it would be 432. Not too bad for the scholars. They're pretty close. Okay? Now, and I'm going to get to the climax in a minute. This is going to kill you. Okay, next we got 35 syllables that takes us from 432 to 397. Last book of the canon given, and then 397. Because that's approximately Malachi's ministry. Alright, that ties, here's the kicker, that ties to the 49 years in Daniel. The 62 weeks don't begin until the 49 years is up. Remember that there are 3 pieces left over from the first temple dying too short. A 70 piece, a 49 piece, and a 7-year piece. The 7-year piece God reserves. He plays the 70 and he plays the 49. That takes you to 397 BC. Now Isaiah's writing this in 712 BC. So Daniel's getting it from God, and God is using Jeremiah's meter to remind Daniel. And he's not just reminding Daniel of all those things that were in the prior videos that I did. He's also doing a year-for-year chronology. Because this, in verse 10, is 35 syllables, which takes you from 432 BC, okay, which is when Malachi came out, to 397, which is the period of his ministry, from what I can tell, on the internet. Alright? Which means that the dates that we got on the internet are accurate, within 6 months. And that takes you to the end of the voting period, which is 396 BC. So the vote is in, the canon is done, the world can go on living. Meanwhile, Moses' personal 1,000 protecting had ended in 440 BC, and of course David's 1,000 is still running, but all of his 490s have run out. The only 490 that's operating is that from the temple. That's the only reason the world can continue. But Israel voted. So not only do you have the 70 years, I have to get into that yet. So here we are, let me backtrack here. Here we are at verse 10, and it's 397 BC by the time, get this content tie. Oh, golly. Wachafetz Yahweh bayado yitzla. Yeah, bayado, his hand. Okay, to succeed, to prosper. What did he prosper? He finished the OT canon, finished the temple, finished Jerusalem by 397, when the 49-year piece in Daniel 9 runs out. I'm just saying it. This is so shocking. Okay, so let's go on. Alright, so now we have verses 11 and 12, which thematically depict resurrection. Alright, payment and resurrection. Okay, resurrection is a kind of birth. Of course, now here we're talking about the countdown to the birth of Messiah. The temple has to be resurrected in order for Messiah to be born. Are you getting the concept play here? This is just totally shocking. Okay, 11 and 12, what do they comprise? 11 is 28 syllables, and 12 is 42 syllables. Okay, so from 397 onward, you're looking at the, that's when the 62 weeks begins to play in the Daniel 9 prophecy. But the 62 weeks is the sum of, and this is sort of off Isaiah's balance sheet, but yet is reflected. The 62 weeks is the sum of the 360 years the temple lasted, because look, it went from 950 BC to 586 BC, that's in the right-hand side. That's 364 years. That's the sum of 364 plus 70, which is verses 11 and 12. So, what would the 28 years of verse 11 represent? because you have to call it's 28 syllables. That represents 28 years. What would that be? Well, the reference point that we're talking about now has skipped. We're no longer talking a straight line from 397 because we got the 364 years reimbursement to the temple. So from 397, 364 years later, is 33 BC. So Isaiah is picking it up at 33 BC because that's an automatic reimbursement because the temple got rebuilt 364 years later. So now the 70 is always tacked on. So now it gets tacked on here, and 28 years after the 364 years. 364 years is going to take you to 33 BC. 33 BC minus 28 is 5 BC. That's when Elizabeth gets pregnant. That's when, at the very end of 5 BC in Jewish terms, because Adar is the last month of the year, that's when Mary gets pregnant. And you see that, except scholars misread it, in Luke 126 and 136, where the angel is making wordplay. I covered that in Past Plot HTM. The official style for the official 6th month of a calendar uses double definite articles. You can see that in Chronicles and Kings. The angel is using double definite articles when he talks to Mary. And then he shows that he's making a play on the fact that it's also the 6th month of Elizabeth's pregnancy in that same verse. Whereas back in Luke 126, they only use one article to show that it's Elizabeth's pregnancy. One article or no article. See, when it's relative, you don't use the article. When it's absolute, you use double articles. And so the angel is talking about the 6th month of the Jewish calendar, which would be Adar on the civil calendar. All right? So 5 BC, at the very end of it, Mary gets pregnant. It's pretty important, huh? And what do we have after that? We have 42 in verse 12. Okay, so what's 42 years? What's 42 years after 5 BC? 37 AD. The outer limit of time due to the 1000th anniversary of David's death, which you'll see back up here. Go back to David. All right. David dies when he's 77. That's another thing scholars miss. Okay? He dies when he's 77. That means he dies in 963 BC. 963 BC plus the 1000-year time grant takes us to 4 BC when Christ is born, and to 37 AD. Let me show you. 37 AD when David's time grant runs out. But Christ is rejected 7 years early. That's the hedge. All right, the outer time limit was 37 even if Christ was accepted, but he wasn't. All right, so Isaiah is taking that into account right here in verse 12. 42 years after Mary gets pregnant is the end of time. The end of allotted time. Because remember, you have to allow for the fact that the pregnancy, the year break, what we call 4 BC, 5 BC, when you're doing subtraction, sometimes you have to add or subtract a 1 because you have to make allowance for the fact that it's early or late in the year. All right, and Isaiah is actually doing that. He's making allowance for when in the year a thing occurs.